Basically, he claimed to have found £225 billion down the back of the Treasury sofa. Good luck with that. Nigel Farage gave a press conference on Tuesday, dominating the news agenda in a week when Westminster is on recess. The vibe was very much "we mean business." On stage behind the Reform leader were representatives of some of the 10 councils that Reform won in the local elections, the mayoralties that they won, and also some of Reform's MPs. The tagline was "Vote Reform, Get Reform," a message that whereas in the past you might have voted Reform as a protest vote and got a Labour or a Conservative candidate, the local elections show that now if you vote Reform there's a very good chance that the winner may in fact be from Reform. The venue was telling. It was held at the Liberal Club. Farage kicked off his speech by saying that what Reform are achieving is the biggest upheaval in British politics since the death of the Liberal Party and the emergence of Labour and the Conservatives as the two parties in British politics. Farage said that the first step in the Reform revolution was him returning to frontline politics and winning enough MPs to form a beachhead in Parliament. As a reminder, Reform won 5 MPs in the July general election. It has since lost one of them with the suspension/defection of Rupert Lowe, but it gained another in the Runcorn and Helsby by-election when Sarah Pochin won by 6 votes. Step 2 was the local elections that we saw in May, where Reform had to prove that the polling leads that have seen them overtake first the Conservatives and now Labour could translate into actual results in an election. And they did. Reform now control 10 councils and £10 billion worth of combined council budgets. They've proved they can win, now they have to prove that they can govern. And from watching Farage's press conference up close, it would seem that step 3 is replacing the Conservatives as the de facto opposition, painting the Labour government as having failed, and going into the next election, whenever that may be, as the only real alternative. Reform has previously used the idea of the uni-party, the idea that Labour and the Conservatives are essentially the same. That was a message that Farage repeated on Tuesday, talking about how the two parties had merged on issues such as consensus on net zero and mass immigration. His message was very much that if voters want something different, they know who to turn to. The interesting thing about the policies that he announced on Tuesday was that they come both from the left and from the right. Farage said that Reform would reverse Labour's scrapping of the winter fuel allowance for most pensioners and also scrap the 2-child benefit cap, which is something that Labour MPs have been agitating for since before the election. But he also said that Reform would implement tax breaks for married couples and talked about raising the income tax threshold to £20,000. If you're wondering how much all this will cost, by the way, it's in the region of billions, as in hundreds of billions. But Farage claimed that he could find the money through scrapping net zero and also getting rid of government spending on quangos. Basically, he claimed to have found £225 billion down the back of the Treasury sofa. Good luck with that. Unsurprisingly, the other parties have been somewhat sceptical about his numbers. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, said it was fantasy economics. Labour talked about fantasy promises and also connected what Farage is suggesting with the Liz Truss era, as did the Lib Dems, who called the policies Trussonomics on steroids. But it's interesting to think about the fact that those policies, winter fuel and child benefit and tax breaks, come from 2 very different strands of British politics, one from Labour and one from the Conservatives. Essentially, Farage is promising to do things that both the Conservatives and Labour really wanted to do, but don't have enough money, at least if they're living in economic reality. It remains to be seen how successful the Liz Truss tactics will be. Keir Starmer has had great fun with the toxicity of the Truss era, criticising the Conservatives. However, it does seem to be an issue that voters associate very much with the Tories. Whether he can transplant that onto what Nigel Farage is suggesting isn't entirely clear. But another attack line that we can see from the major parties against Reform is going to revolve around governance. As I said, they now control £10 billion worth of council budgets. They're running these councils and it's now up to Reform to prove that they can provide the services. Already, they're running into some issues with that. For example, one of the first things the new Reform Council in Lincolnshire did was scrap the Flood and Water Management Scrutiny Committee, which might sound like something the council didn't particularly need until you remember that Lincolnshire is one of the areas in the country most prone to, you've guessed it, flooding. Andrea Jenkins, the new mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, also made a big point about how the council would be firing all DEI, that's diversity, equality and inclusion officers employed by the council. Lots of money to be saved there, except it turned out the council didn't actually employ any. Talk of saving lots of money by scrapping waste on councils also misses the fact that by far the biggest thing that councils spend money on, over 2/3 of their budget in most cases, is adult and child social care. Now, I actually asked Nigel Farage about Reform's plans for social care at the press conference. He told me that he couldn't wave a magic wand and fix the issues, but Reform were going to think very carefully about it and, I don't know, come up with some kind of plan. In other words, he doesn't have an answer, just like Labour, the Conservatives and Lib Dems don't have an answer on the biggest policy challenge that councils have been facing for decades. But it is going to be interesting to see how Reform councils manage to handle their statutory obligations to constituents in those councils when it turns out that the money that they promised they'd be able to save doesn't actually materialise. Now, let's talk about polls because there are some interesting trends emerging. Reform have now come top above the Conservatives and Labour in a number of polls. They're polling at between 28 and 32%, depending on the pollster. The Conservatives are on 19 to 21, Labour are around 22, and the Lib Dems and the Greens are also on the rise. But what's interesting about these polls is that if you run them as head-to-heads, as in who would make the best Prime Minister, Nigel Farage or Keir Starmer, or Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage loses in every case. What I think we're seeing in the polls is Reform as the most popular party out of a fractured electorate that is split between 4, 5, 6 different parties. But when it comes down to would you rather see him in Downing Street or not, there's a higher proportion of voters who are going for the or not version. Now, why is this interesting? If it looks like the story of the next election is Labour versus Reform, could we see an anti-Reform backlash movement emerging where voters think tactfully and go for the anyone but Nigel Farage option? Seems unlikely now. Obviously, we're 4 years out from an election, but the Reform people I've spoken to have said that if Reform become the story, that backlash effect could be really significant. Interestingly, in those head-to-heads, Nigel Farage doesn't just lose by 15 points to Keir Starmer, he also loses by 4 points to Kemi Badenoch. So good news there for the Tories, I guess. God knows they need some. Going back to Reform's image, both at the press conference and beyond, it's clear that Nigel Farage is working very hard to professionalise the party. Brown corduroy out, snazzy suits in. But there are interesting questions there about party management and infighting as well. Reform changed its constitution at its conference at the end of last year to give members a bit more power and control, but essentially it is still very much the Nigel Farage show. For a party of 5 MPs to lose one of them in a row that has seen Rupert Lowe go off on his own isn't a great look. But it's interesting that the Rupert Lowe incident doesn't seem to have hit Reform support. Conservatives who were hoping that the party would just descend into infighting, as UKIP so often did, have been disappointed. There's also a money aspect. Reform were able to win over Nick Candy, formerly a big Conservative donor. They haven't yet got that $1 million donation from Elon Musk, and it looks like that may not be forthcoming. But it was interesting during the local election campaign to see Nigel Farage riding around on a JCB digger. JCB owner, obviously, Lord Bamford, hosted Boris Johnson's wedding very generously, another key Conservative figure. So you can see Reform moving on to the Conservative territory in more ways than one, and a big way is money. Now, how are the two main parties responding to this? Well, the Conservatives are in a bit of a tailspin. Labour, really interestingly, has come out and said that they view Reform as the main opposition in vibes, if not actually in seats. And you're seeing this playing out every week at PMQs. Keir Starmer looks quite relaxed, quite unbothered when Kemi Badenoch asks her 6 questions, but as soon as there's a question from Nigel Farage, he looks more alert and he gives an answer that has very clearly been planned to hit all of Reform's weak spots. You're also seeing planted questions where friendly Labour MPs stand up to ask the Prime Minister something about green jobs or workers' rights so that he can pivot and show how Reform are acting against workers' interests in these ways. What are some key Labour attack lines about Reform? Well, one is that Reform MPs voted against Labour's working rights package, even though Nigel Farage claims to be the party leader who best represents working people. One is about net zero and green jobs. One is about past comments that Farage has made about the NHS and moving to a US-style insurance-based system. So expect to hear lots of lines from Labour MPs about how Reform wants to sell our NHS to the Americans. And also Farage's past closeness to Donald Trump and stated admiration for Vladimir Putin has been raised, allowing Keir Starmer to argue that the Reform leader is unpatriotic. Expect to see all these turbocharged now that Reform are this high on the political agenda, along with all the accusations that Nigel Farage wants to crash the economy and be, as Keir Starmer put it this week, Truss 2.0. The Conservatives, meanwhile, are still in a bit of a tailspin. Voices on the Tory side for some kind of electoral pact to, quote-unquote, unite the right are growing. The problem with this is twofold. One is a fundamental misunderstanding about why voters are choosing Reform in the first place. Yes, there are some disaffected Conservative voters flocking to Nigel Farage's party, but for the most part, they're not doing so because they believe that Reform is a more right-wing version of the Conservative Party. They're doing so because they believe the Conservative Party is fundamentally broken. And two is that Farage doesn't really have any incentive to make a pact with the Conservatives. As we discussed, Reform overtook the Tories in the polls earlier this year. They're now polling at around 30%. They don't need a pact with the Conservatives to move forward. In fact, you could argue that doing so would dilute their message. That said, it's in everyone's interest to keep the rumours of a pact alive as long as possible. All in all, the idea that you can just take Reform support in one column, Conservative support in another column, add them up and get an electoral force that could challenge Labour is sadly not grounded in reality. Keep an eye on Reform's policy positions and watch how they are moving from being a party very much seen as to the right of the Conservatives as moving into left-wing ground on issues like nationalisation or even benefits. There's also a slightly pro-natalist slant to all of this, although he himself did acknowledge at the press conference that he doesn't have the best track record in this area. Expect the party to keep talking lots about immigration, both legal and illegal, but it's clear that they've moved into many other areas now, and the big one to watch is net zero. Can Reform turn net zero into the next Brexit issue? That's certainly what they're trying to do. We shall see. For the next 4 years, though, Reform has a bigger job, which is governing the councils that it actually has. The most effective way for the other parties to challenge Nigel Farage may be to just wait and see how it all plays out. After all, as George Washington tells Hamilton in the hit Broadway musical, winning was easy, young man, governing's harder.